There's a kind of absence that matters. Not the absence of a name you forgot, not the absence of a face you never met. The other kind. The kind where something is missing from the story, but you can still feel the shape it left behind. Because sometimes what disappears doesn't truly leave. Sometimes it just stops being spoken aloud. There's a group of gods most people have never heard of, not because they were small, not because they were insignificant, but because they were never meant to be remembered the way other gods are remembered. They don't sit comfortably in the modern imagination. They don't fit into the familiar shelves, Zeus and Thunder, Odin, and Raven's gods as characters' gods as drama. The Anunnaki weren't adored like that. They were obeyed. Not like myth, like law. And that difference changes everything. Ancient Mesopotamian texts don't describe them as creators in the way later traditions describe creation. One voice, one moment, one grand beginning. They describe them as administrators, as organizers, as the ones who divide labor, assign roles, make decisions through councils, and enforce consequence. And when their names faded, something strange happened. Their names disappeared. But the framework did not. The idea that authority must be justified. The idea that law exists above rulers. The idea that order precedes chaos, that structure is older than ambition. That architecture never left. It's still here. And tonight, we're not just looking at tablets and ruins. We're looking at something quieter, the way an early belief system became the invisible design of civilization itself. The way it slipped into the foundations so deep that eventually nobody could see it as foreign anymore. In the ruins of ancient Uruk, archaeologists unearthed thousands of cuneiform tablets dating back over 5,000 years. And what they found wasn't what most people expect when they hear the phrase ancient religion. Not poetic hymns, not symbolic legends meant to comfort frightened farmers. Administrative records, temple accounts, ration lists, divine payroll logs, paperwork if paper existed, infrastructure pressed into clay. And inside that mundane machinery, something was already complete. A theology. Not a theology in its infancy. Not a religion experimenting, improvising slowly, gathering its gods like a village gathers stories over generations. No. This was theology already operational, already hierarchical, already bureaucratic. Gods with jurisdictions, gods with ranks, gods who assign tasks, enforce moral law, legitimize kingship, not as metaphor, but as structure. The moment humans began to write, they were already documenting a cosmos that looked like an institution. No trial period, no visible evolution, no rough draft of divinity, just order, fully formed, written down as if it had always been there. And that's where something fractures. Because the traditional view is comforting in its gradualness. It says belief systems develop slowly. Nature worship becomes ancestor veneration. Ancestors become spirits. Spirits become pantheons. Pantheons become organized religion. Complexity rises in stages like dawn. But the Sumerian record doesn't show that dawn. It shows the sun already in the sky. Writing appears. Law appears. Theology appears. All at once. Structured, specific, naming a particular group of deities who govern reality itself. And if you really step closer, the Anunnaki sit too near the evidence. In the earliest king lists, rulership is not described as something humans seize, not something they bargain for, not something they invent when cities get large enough to need it. Rulership descended from heaven. That phrase looks simple, but it's not, because it means human authority was granted, delegated, bestowed, already legitimate before any king ever wore a crown. Kingship isn't an achievement in this telling, it's an office. And in creation myths, the universe isn't born from chaos and a romantic surge of beginnings. It's organized through assignment, through separation, through jobs and boundaries and delegated roles. Even humanity's purpose is defined with unsettling precision. We exist to maintain divine order, not to dominate creation, not to rule the world, to maintain it. And again, this doesn't read like a primitive guess. It reads like a response to complexity. It reads like a system built to solve a problem. And that's the first loop we have to return to again and again, because the question won't stop asking itself. Why does the first written society already sound like it's reading from an established manual? Why would the oldest texts describe divine councils, making decisions, as if governance existed before humans invented it? Why would a civilization at the beginning already possess a complete model of kingship morality, labor, justice, fully developed terms, fully developed roles? And why does this structure reappear later across cultures that come after Mesopotamia, even when the names change, high gods presiding over lesser beings? Humans created to serve order, moral resets through catastrophe, floods as enforcement, kingship as delegation, not invention. It returns, and returns, and returns, and no single mechanism explains that return. Fire alone can't explain it. Trade alone can't explain it. Conquest alone can't explain it. But a sequence of all three over time can carry something deeper than names. It can carry a framework, an idea so embedded in the structure of early civilization that it survives even after the gods themselves are forgotten. So imagine this for a moment, not as a claim, but as a lens. What if belief is not always a creative act? What if the earliest human societies did not invent their gods so much as inherit them as frameworks, as conceptual tools, as a language for authority and consequence, and the division of labor in a world that suddenly becomes organized by cities, temples, and law, not literal beings necessarily, but remembered structures. And if that's the case, then the tablets begin to feel different. The king lists crediting gods with teaching rulership. The myths describing creation as assignment. The economic tablets tracking divine offerings as if gods require accountants. They stop feeling like fantasy. They start feeling like infrastructure memory passed down through clay, ritual, institutional practice across thousands of years. And then the question shifts. Not, did the Anunnaki exist as physical beings, but why did humanity need them? What problem were these beliefs solving? And why did the framework they introduced, law above rulers, heaven above earth, morality enforced by higher authority, outlive the gods themselves? Because the evidence doesn't vanish. It spreads. From Sumer to Akkad, to Babylon, to Assyria, into Hittite lands, into Canaanite cities, and eventually into biblical tradition. Always adapted, always recognizable. Carrying the same basic architecture, divine council's moral judgment floods as resets, kingship as delegation. And yet maybe the hardest part is not the tablets, it's the reaction to them. Universities treat them as literature, not history. Museums display them as art, not evidence. Theologians classify them as myth, not memory. And notice the pattern: the more structured the belief, the more quickly it gets explained away as metaphor rather than examined as foundation. But the clay remains. And beneath the oldest written words on earth is a possibility no institution loves to hold too close to the light. We did not invent the idea of divine order. We inherited it. And if that's true, then the world we live within the assumption that authority must be justified, that law must come from somewhere higher than human will, that the universe operates according to structure rather than chaos, was not born from philosophy. It was born from the Anunnaki. Not because they were gods in the way we think of gods now, but because they were how early humans learned to think. So the first question then is the simplest. When does this system first appear in the record, not in legend, not in an oral tradition we can't trace, but in clay, in marks? In writing at the moment, humanity begins to organize thought itself. And what we find is not a slow dawn of belief. We find a structure already built, waiting to be written down. And the next step takes us to the place where it begins not in temples, but in garbage piles. Uruk, southern Mesopotamia, around 3100 BC. Uruk doesn't announce itself like a myth. It arrives like a fact. Archaeologists didn't find the first tablets displayed on an altar. They didn't uncover them lined up neatly inside some sacred chamber, preserved as if everyone knew they were holding history in their hands. They found them in discarded layers, in refuse, in the thrown-away remains of daily life. Garbage piles. And that detail matters because it strips away the romance we want to attach to origins. It tells us quietly that writing didn't begin as poetry. It didn't begin as scripture. It began as administration, as counting, as the discipline of tracking what must be tracked when life becomes too dense to hold in memory. Thousands of small clay fragments baked hard, marked with wedge-shaped signs. At first glance, they resemble receipts, grain livestock rations, mundane accounting. But translation changes the atmosphere. Because the further the marks are deciphered, the more it becomes clear that these were not merely economic documents. They were theological ledgers, lists of gods receiving offerings, divine names paired with temples, rations distributed to deities, as if the deities were employees of the state. The gods were being paid, and the system tracking them was already complete. There's no pilot version visible, no tentative early stage where scribes first try out a few divine names like a society trying on new ideas. The moment writing appears at Uruk, it is already documenting a cosmos with divisions, hierarchies, assigned roles. And among those roles, again and again, there is the collective presence of the Anunnaki, not as vague spirits, not as half-formed shadows, but as a governing category invoked in oaths, referenced in disputes, woven into boundary stones, credited in hymns that treat their authority as an operational reality. This is not the beginning of belief. This is belief already in motion. And notice how strange that is, because the Uruk period is often called the birth of civilization. Writing appears, urban planning appears, monumental architecture appears. And buried within that same moment, without a visible, slow ramp-up in the archaeological record, is a fully operational theology. No trial runs, no rough drafts of divinity, no slow climb from animism to pantheon. The first written words already assume cosmic law, already assume divine jurisdiction, already assume moral accountability enforced by a known assembly. Why conventional timelines want gradualness? They want belief to mature over centuries, simple ideas layering into complex systems. Hunter-gatherers personify nature. Farmers venerate ancestors. Settlements grow, priesthoods formalize. Theology becomes organized. That's the story we expect, because it's the story we can narrate smoothly. But Sumer doesn't feel smooth. The earliest god lists, attributed to the Uruk context, don't show a single deity slowly accumulating lesser spirits beneath it. They show dozens at once, already ranked, already assigned, already distributed across cosmic functions: sky gods, earth gods, underworld gods, grain gods, justice gods, destiny gods. And threaded through these lists and hymns, sometimes explicit, sometimes embedded, is the Anunnaki portrayed not as the ones who invented the world, but as the ones who organize it. They decide, they assign, they judge, they enforce. And the way the texts speak of them is important. They are not worshipped like distant, unknowable powers who might be pleased or offended. They are consulted, obeyed, accounted to. It's administrative language. Temple economies weren't symbolic performances. They were functioning institutions. Priests tracked divine offerings with the same precision they tracked grain storage. Rituals followed calendars calibrated to celestial observation. Sacred architecture aligned to cosmic cycles with a seriousness that implies continuity and transmission knowledge held over generations, refined, preserved. And everything rations, rituals, alignments was justified by reference to an order treated as pre-existing, not invented, not improvised, already there. Which loops us back to the unnerving question inherited from what? Because the deeper problem isn't that Sumer has a complex theology. The deeper problem is that there's no clear earlier Sumerian civilization in the record where we can watch the complexity assemble itself. Southern Mesopotamian cities emerge suddenly in the late 4th millennium BC, already urban, already hierarchical, already literate, already theologically sophisticated. Archaeologists have searched for precursors. They've excavated earlier settlements, mapped irrigation techniques, tracked material continuity in pottery styles and trade, and they do find continuity in things. Tools, graves, shrines. But they find discontinuity in thought. Earlier communities leave behind modest traces, human traces. What they do not leave behind are king lists, formal cosmologies, law codes justified by divine councils. That entire intellectual architecture appears only when writing appears, as if documentation and system are inseparable, as if the structure needs clay to survive. And then inside the tablets themselves, you find moments that sharpen the paradox. An oath sworn before the Anunnaki concerning something mundane like a boundary dispute. Farmland, irrigation rights, ordinary conflict. But the invocation is not ordinary. The scribe doesn't ask the gods to witness the truth as a hopeful gesture. He assumes they already know it. He references them as present, observing, ready to enforce consequence. The moral universe is already functioning. Another tablet cataloged, largely ignored for decades, lists divine jurisdictions. One governs irrigation, another oversees livestock fertility, another ensures proper rotation of festivals, again, assignments, job descriptions, cosmic bureaucracy. And the question historians tend to avoid is the most obvious one. Why would the first written civilization need a cosmic bureaucracy? Cities require organization. Labor must be divided. Disputes must be arbitrated. Authority must be justified. That much is clear. But why justify it by invoking gods whose titles and hierarchies are already fixed? Why not invent gods as needed incrementally, like later cultures demonstrably do? Unless the gods were not being invented, unless they were being remembered, not as physical beings necessarily, but as conceptual structures, as names given to the forces that make order intelligible when order becomes too complex to navigate through kinship alone. And the name that keeps returning in the earliest layers is the Anunnaki. Their description shifts in number, sometimes 50, sometimes 7, sometimes collective, sometimes individual. But functionally, they remain consistent. They decide. They assign. They judge. They stabilize. They make the world make sense. And by the time scribes begin compiling king lists in the early 3rd millennium BC, the Anunnaki are already treated as ancient. Those king lists describe kingship as descending from heaven before the flood, a flood that divides time into 2 regions, mythic duration and historical recognition. Before the flood reigns stretch into impossible lengths. After reigns become human, but legitimacy doesn't change. Authority remains divine. The same cosmic hierarchy, the same moral order, the same sense that law is not invented but implemented. And the deeper you examine Uruk material, the sharper the paradox becomes. This is not a civilization groping toward coherence. This is a civilization beginning with coherence already in place, as if the entire system was handed down intact, waiting to be written. And if belief systems usually evolve slowly accumulating layers, then why does the earliest written civilization appear already complete? And why does every attempt to trace it backward lead not to earlier belief, but to silence? The silence doesn't last. It gives way to something else. Precision. Because in the surviving text, the Anunnaki are not described vaguely. They are not wind spirits. They are not water spirits. They are a class, a category, a defined assembly. And the role they occupy is not like most ancient gods. Most pantheons grow from nature. Sun becomes God. Storm becomes God. River becomes God. Symbols migrate slowly through trade and iconography and time. But the Anunnaki resist that pattern. They are not personifications of landscape. They are judges, decision makers, enforcers of divine law, governance, not worship. And to understand what that means, we have to move deeper into the texts where they appear not as characters in the story, but as the framework that decides what the story is allowed to become. The Anunnaki almost never stand in the spotlight. That's part of what makes them difficult to hold in the mind. They're not the storm god hurling thunder, not the sun god rising in glory. They're not dramatic. They're procedural. They appear in the way a courtroom appears, in the way a constitution appears, in the way an institution appears already standing, already authoritative, already assumed. The earliest Sumerian god lists organized deities into hierarchies. At the top sit the great gods, sky, air, waters below the earth, names that later traditions preserve in full stories and epics. But beneath them, woven through the structure, are the Anunnaki, sometimes listed separately, sometimes embedded within councils, always plural, always collective, and almost every time they're named, they're associated with judgment. Not persuasion, not inspiration, judgment. In one hymn recovered from Nippur, the Anunnaki are described as those who determine destinies. The language isn't gentle. It doesn't imply suggestion. It implies finality. What they decide is fixed. Another fragment from a temple archive describes them as witnesses to oaths. And in this context, witness doesn't mean a passive observer. It means an enforcing presence. Swear an oath, and the unseen assembly stands behind the words. Break it, and the consequences aren't merely social. They are cosmic. This isn't metaphor in the way we usually mean it. This is procedure. And procedure points to a question that feels almost too simple. Who are they governing? For most ancient deities govern domains. Sea, storm, harvest. Their power is tied to an element, and worship is tied to survival within that element. But the Anunnaki do not govern elements. They govern order itself. And that difference becomes unmistakable in the myth known as the descent of Inanna. Inanna, powerful, central queenly, passes into the underworld. At each gate, she is stripped of her divine regalia. And when she reaches the throne room, she is brought before the Anunnaki, seated in judgment. And something happens that is easy to miss if you read it quickly. They do not bow to her. They do not defer. They condemn her. Even Inanna, goddess of war and fertility, is subject to their authority. The myth does not argue for their supremacy. It does not explain it. It simply assumes it. Their word is final. And the story isn't about good versus evil. It's about jurisdiction, about who holds authority in which realm. In the underworld, the Anunnaki decide, and the pattern repeats. In king lists, in boundary inscriptions, in legal oaths. The Anunnaki are never the heroes, never the protagonists. They are the framework within which the protagonists move, the ones who decide what happens next. And by the time Akkadian scribes begin translating and adapting Sumerian material in the late 3rd millennium BC, their name carries connotations of high-status beings of princely bloodline, not outsiders, elevated through worship. They were not made gods. They began as gods. And their role remains consistent. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, they appear during the flood narrative. Not as the ones who send the flood, that decision belongs elsewhere. But when the flood begins, the Anunnaki are described as present in the heavens, weeping. And the text doesn't tell you why. It doesn't explain their tears in a tidy moral lesson. It simply records their presence, as if no cosmic decision could occur without them. As if the legitimacy of catastrophe requires an assembly. Again, procedure. And this is what separates them from many other divine figures in ancient myth. They do not act on impulse. They do not rage and clash endlessly. They convene. They deliberate. They decide. And once decided, the decision holds. Scholars can interpret this as human imagination, humans projecting their political systems onto the sky, building a divine bureaucracy to make the world feel ordered. And that interpretation might hold weight, but it doesn't fully explain the consistency across centuries, across cities, across political shifts. Scribes continue to reference the same assembly in the same way. Empires rise and fall. Gods rise to prominence and fade. Dynasties change their preferred patron deities. And yet the Anunnaki persist. Why not replace them? Why not invent new gods, more closely tied to new rulers? Why does the assembly remain unchanged while everything else is rearranged? In a hymn from Eridu, one of the oldest continuously inhabited sites in Mesopotamia, the Anunnaki are described as existing before the land was raised from waters, before geography, before creation itself, in some tellings. And their first act is not to create, it is to organize, to divide, to assign, to establish boundaries, to make the formless function. This is not how nature spirits behave. This is administration. And in the Babylonian Enuma Elish composed later, drawing from older traditions, the Anunnaki appear again not as creators, but as ratifiers. When Marduk establishes cosmic order, the Anunnaki convene to confirm his authority. They do not grant him power. They recognize it as if recognition is what makes power legitimate. Even when Mesopotamian religion evolves, even when new gods rise to prominence, the Anunnaki remain foundational. City gods can be replaced. Dynastic patron gods can fade. But the gods who govern judgment and destiny and cosmic law cannot be discarded without collapsing the structure. And that may be the key, because what the Anunnaki represent is not simply a group of gods. They represent the concept that order must be legitimized, that authority must be procedural, that decisions, especially world-shaping decisions, must be ratified. And once a civilization embeds that concept into its foundations, it becomes difficult to remove. It becomes difficult even to see it as a concept. It starts to feel like reality. Which brings us to the way this framework expresses itself on Earth. Not in myth, in kingship. In Mesopotamia, the king's first act is not to seize power, it is to receive it. The distinction sounds minor, almost semantic. It isn't. Across the ancient world, rulers often claim authority through conquest, birthright, or direct divine identity. But in Mesopotamia, kingship is delegated, and delegated from beyond human reach. The Sumerian king list begins with a sentence that refuses to sit still in the mind. When kingship descended from heaven, not established, not claimed, descended. The verb matters because it carries an assumption. Legitimacy precedes the ruler. The ruler is not the source. The ruler is the recipient. And the list moves backward through time. And as it does, reigns stretch into impossible lengths, tens of thousands of years, recorded with the same numerical precision used for rations and taxes. Scholars call it mythic exaggeration, a blending of legend and chronology. And perhaps it is. But the text doesn't treat it as a fable. It treats it as record, as if the only difference between pre-flood kings and post-flood kings is duration, not legitimacy. As if kingship itself never changed, only the humans holding it. And what the list doesn't explain, what it leaves as silence, is who granted this authority, But other texts step into that silence. Coronation hymns describe kings as chosen by divine authority, and that choice is not romantic. It is procedural. Consultations occur, fitness is weighed, decisions are confirmed. The Anunnaki are part of that confirmation. And suddenly, kingship starts to look less like a personal triumph and more like an office within a cosmic structure. Political theory, written as theology. And that's where we go next, into the way divine delegation doesn't just grant power, but limits it. Because in this system, authority is not only bestowed from above, it is judged from above. And the judge is not a single god's mood, it is an assembly. Why would early rulers need to justify authority this way? That question keeps returning because it refuses easy answers. On one level, it seems obvious rulers always want legitimacy. They want stability. They want obedience without constant violence. But on another level, it's strange. Kings with armies can take what they want. Kings with wealth can buy what they need. Force through most of human history is justification enough. And yet in Mesopotamia, force is never presented as enough. Power must be legitimate. And legitimacy in the Sumerian worldview can only come from something beyond human contestation, something older than ambition, something external, something that exists before any king is born and remains after any king dies. This is not superstition. It's stabilization. A king who claims divine delegation becomes difficult to remove. His authority doesn't rest solely on strength. It rests on the belief that challenging him is challenging the structure that appointed him. Rebellion becomes not just treason, it becomes sacrilege. And yet the system contains a second, quieter force limitation. Because the same framework that grants authority also restricts it. If law is divine, then the king cannot rewrite it at will without losing legitimacy. He is a steward, a caretaker, a shepherd, not the owner of the flock. That metaphor returns again and again. Kings do not own their people. They tend them. They guide them according to instructions they did not write. And those instructions trace back again and again to divine order. In legal prologues and hymns, rulers do not say, "I invented justice." They say, "I established justice in accordance with the word of the God." The word came first. The king enforces it. This inversion is so constant that it becomes invisible. Modern readers see a king issuing laws and assume the king is the source. But the texts insist otherwise. Law descends, the king implements. And that means kingship is conditional. A king can lose legitimacy, not merely through military defeat, but through divine withdrawal. Later, Mesopotamian historiography repeatedly frames political collapse as a moral event. The gods withdrew their blessing. The king failed as steward. Order broke, and kingship moved elsewhere. The authority remains. Only the human vessel changes. And this returns us again to the Anunnaki. Because when authority is procedural and legitimacy is external, it needs an enforcing logic. It needs a reason people accept as beyond negotiation. The Anunnaki embody that logic. They are the idea that justice is not whatever a ruler declares, but whatever a higher structure recognizes. They are the concept that destiny and judgment are determined, not improvised. And if that's true, then kingship becomes one expression of a deeper architectural principle. Order precedes individuals, which brings us to creation itself. Because if Mesopotamian society treats authority as descending, as delegated, as procedural, what does its cosmology look like? It looks the same. The Mesopotamian creation framework does not obsess over the romance of origin, the way later Western traditions often do. It is not primarily concerned with the moment something comes into being. It is concerned with governance, with boundaries, with what happens when boundaries are violated. In the Enuma Elish, the cosmos begins not as void, but as undifferentiated mixture, fresh and salt water mingled without form. There is no clean beginning. There is only separation. The gods do not create matter. They organize it. They divide the waters, assign stations, establish limits. Creation is not generative. It is architectural. The world becomes recognizable only after roles and jurisdictions exist. And the myth's drama is not about curiosity. It's about disorder. Younger gods grow noisy and disruptive. A plan forms to destroy them. A counteraction occurs. Violence breaks out not as moral lesson, but as enforcement. Chaos becomes a threat. Stability becomes the goal. And when a champion is chosen, that champion does not simply act out of destiny. He negotiates. He demands authority as the price of restoring order. And once order is established, the cosmos is arranged like a managed system. Stars placed, calendars fixed, seasons, distributed time, itself regulated. And after that, a practical problem emerges. The gods are exhausted. The system cannot function if the gods must maintain it directly. So, humanity is created as labor, not from love, not for companionship, not as a celebration, as solution. The text is explicit. Humanity exists to perform the labor of the gods, so the gods may rest. And the tone is important. It is matter of fact. It feels less like myth meant to inspire wonder, and more like policy meant to justify structure. And the myth was recited ritually again and again during festivals, not for entertainment reinforcement. Each recitation reminded the population, order is not natural, it is enforced. Chaos is always near, one violation away, and obedience labor offerings ritual is not optional. It is maintenance. This is creation as contract. The gods organize the cosmos. Humanity maintains it. Stability continues as long as the system is upheld. And within that contract, the Anunnaki do what they always do. They ratify. They confirm. They legitimize what is already decided. And once legitimized, the structure becomes permanent. Human purpose becomes fixed. Later myths echo the same theme humanity created, because gods are tired of digging canals. Again, work. Again, narrow purpose. Again, not tragedy, but solution. And here, the loop returns again, because we have to ask it more than once from different angles until it becomes unavoidable. Why would the earliest civilizations define humanity's purpose so narrowly? Why frame existence not as freedom, not as partnership, but as maintenance? Why does this framework persist across centuries, across political change, always returning to the same uncomfortable idea? We are made not to transcend the system, but to preserve it. Because once you accept that the primary problem is not origin, but order, the next stage becomes clearer. The first calendars weren't invented to track time. They were invented to survive it. And survival in southern Mesopotamia demanded precision. Floods were unpredictable. Plant too early, seedlings drown. Plant too late, soil hardens. Irrigate incorrectly, fields turn to salt. Timing wasn't convenience, it was existence. And according to the texts, timing was governed by gods. The deeper we move into temple archives, the more we see that astronomy and ritual are inseparable from agriculture and administration. The sky is not curiosity, it is schedule. And schedule in this system is divine. So, next we step into the temple records, where practical life becomes theological procedure, where the movements of stars become the movements of gods, and where the economy runs as if divine beings are receiving rations like officials. Because once religion becomes survival technology, the question changes again. Could they afford not to believe? In a world like southern Mesopotamia, survival does not tolerate vagueness. The rivers do not negotiate. The sun does not compromise. Salt does not forgive mistakes. The Tigris and Euphrates flood unpredictably. Plant too early and the water erases the work. Plant too late and the ground hardens. Mismanage irrigation and the soil turns hostile over time, quietly, inevitably. So precision becomes a kind of devotion. And the deeper you examine Mesopotamian agriculture, the more you realize the texts do not separate practical knowledge from theology. They braid them together until you can't tell which thread came first. Temple archives contain thousands of administrative tablets, ration distributions, labor assignments, grain storage records. Mundane, repetitive, relentless. But woven into them is something else. Astronomical observation recorded with ritual regularity. Phases of the moon, positions of Venus, rising of specific stars at specific times. And the tone of these records matters. They are not notes. They are not hobbyist curiosity. They are treated as necessary because the gods require it. Agricultural festivals are not simply celebrations. They are scheduled labor within a divine timetable. Planting and harvest are not merely human decisions. They are permissions. In one tablet from a temple context, scribes record precise days for planting, to begin not chosen by farmers, but determined by the deity's sanctioned timing. Priests consult star charts, calculate lunar cycles, announce the day when the earth may be worked without violating cosmic schedule. Miss the day, and the harvest fails. Not only because of poor farming, because order has been violated. And here again the loop returns. This is not theology layered on top of practical knowledge like decoration. This is practical knowledge inseparable from theology. The canals are sacred. The hymns describe irrigation as divine instruction. Techniques for controlling water flow, distributing irrigation, preventing ruin over time framed, not as slow human innovation, but as teachings revealed by gods. Not inspiration, instruction, step by step, procedural. In mythic fragments, gods teach humans how to plant grain, build cities, organize labor. And the teaching is not abstract moral philosophy. It includes methods, tools, practices. The plow is not discovered through random trial. It is introduced through authority. And the calendar itself, lunar and solar synchronized, requires continuous observation and periodic adjustment. This is not primitive timekeeping. It is careful astronomical maintenance. But the justification remains theological. The celestial bodies follow appointed routes. Stars move by schedule. Planets travel like gods traveling. To track the sky is to track the gods. To predict cycles is to anticipate divine presence. And there's something unsettling here, not in the concept itself, but in the implication of continuity. By the time scribes record astronomical data in later centuries, they are not starting from scratch. They are continuing. The precision suggests accumulated observation preserved through temple schools, held in archives transmitted across generations. And that raises a quiet question that won't go away. Who began those observations, and why was the knowledge framed as divine rather than human? The temple economy deepens the pattern. Temples are not only religious centers, they are economic hubs. They control grain storage, distribute rations, manage labor forces, track offerings with bureaucratic clarity. And every transaction is written as if the gods participate. Workers receive rations from temple stores, yet the language treats it as payment from deities. Priests track allocations to specific gods. Offerings are logged with quantities and timing, as though the gods require delivery. Daily bread rations for a goddess amount listed quality, specified delivery time, noted, not poetry, accounting. And accounting by nature is not comfortable with symbolism. It is built on assumed legitimacy. Even if the gods are not physically consuming the bread, the system must act as though the offering matters. Because the offering is not merely gift, it is maintenance. If the structure collapses into just fiction, it loses its force. It loses its ability to stabilize behavior. It loses its ability to anchor schedule and law. Which is why in this context, religion stops being mere belief and becomes survival technology. The agricultural calendar dictates planting. The temple economy dictates distribution. Astronomical charts dictate ritual timing to maintain balance. And all of it is justified by reference to gods who teach, not gods who simply exist, gods who instruct. And this is where the question shifts. If the calendar, the harvest, the economy, the daily rhythm of existence are inseparable from theology, then the question is no longer did they believe. The question is could they afford not to? Because if the system works, if it stabilizes, harvests, reduces conflict, coordinates, labor, and makes a city function, then disbelief is not a private opinion. It is a threat, a refusal to participate in the machinery that keeps order intact. And this is the quiet engine behind the Anunnaki's role, because the Anunnaki are not primarily about nature. They are about order. They are the ones who legitimize the structure, the ones invoked in oaths, the ones associated with consequences beyond immediate human reach. They are the framework that turns schedule into obligation, obligation into morality, morality into cosmic enforcement. So, what happens when this system moves beyond Mesopotamia? What happens when trade routes carry not just goods, but habits of thought? What happens when empires conquer and administrators bring with them an assumption authority must be justified by something higher? The names will change. They always change. But what survives is not the names. It is the architecture beneath them. By 1500 BC, Mesopotamian civilization has been exporting texts, techniques, and theological concepts for centuries. Scribes trained in cuneiform travel to distant courts. Merchants carry stories. Conquerors impose administrative systems that embed assumptions. And the strange part is what survives. Not the original gods, not the original hymns, not even the original myths intact. What survives is the framework, divine councils, hierarchy, procedural authority, catastrophe as moral reset, kingship as delegation. The logic travels even when the language doesn't. And in the archives of distant cultures, Hittite, Canaanite, you find structures that feel familiar even when the names are not. The framework persists because it functions as infrastructure, and you do not remove infrastructure without replacing it. And no one at the time has a better system. So next we step westward into Hittite archives and coastal cities where the gods are renamed, the stories are adjusted, and yet the same architecture remains in place like an unseen skeleton. Because that is what inheritance looks like. Not a statue carried intact, a structure, a way of thinking that survives its original voice. If you want to see how a framework survives, you don't look for identical stories. You look for identical structure. Names are easy to replace. Characters can be swapped. Languages can shift. But a system and architecture tends to persist because once a culture builds on it removing, it would mean rebuilding everything. And that is what makes the transmission beyond Mesopotamia so strange, because what travels is not devotion to the Anunnaki. What travels is the logic the Anunnaki represent. In the Hittite archives at Hattusa, archaeologists recovered thousands of clay tablets written in cuneiform, diplomatic correspondence, treaties, trade agreements. But mixed among them are myths, stories that feel in their bones Mesopotamian. And when translated, the familiarity is not in the names. It is in the procedure. A divine council convenes. High gods sit in assembly. Lesser gods present arguments. A decision is reached through deliberation, not dictation, not raw force. Deliberation. Scholars recognize the resemblance because it is too close to dismiss. The Hittites absorb the concept that cosmic decisions require consensus, that authority is procedural, that even gods operate within hierarchy. But they rewrite the participants. They substitute their own deities. They adjust the narrative to fit their world. The framework travels, the gods do not. Further west in Ugarit, coastal city trade hub scribes leave behind texts in an entirely different script. Alphabetic, not cuneiform. A language closer to Hebrew than Akkadian. And yet when those texts are translated, the structure again is unmistakable. A supreme God presides over a council of divine beings. He consults, he deliberates, he assigns roles. Lesser gods carry out decisions. The governance of reality is not solitary, it is assembly. The terminology changes, the names change, but the concept remains. The cosmos is administered by a hierarchy of divine beings who convene deliberate and enforce order. And this is not coincidence. It is inheritance. Ugarit is a place where merchants pass through, where scribes work in multiple languages, where ideas move along the same routes as metal and grain. And once ideas are embedded in legal language and ritual practice, they become infrastructure. You cannot remove infrastructure without replacement. So the framework spreads, adapted and disguised appearing in cultures that never speak the word Anunnaki, but operate as though an assembly must exist somewhere behind the world. Even in early Hebrew texts, traces remain quiet, uncomfortable traces. Later editors smooth them over. Later theology reframes them. But the structure resists erasure because the structure is doing work. In Psalm 82, God stands in the divine assembly and judges among the gods. The text does not deny their existence. It subordinates them. It calls them divine beings and holds them accountable for governing unjustly. This is not fully developed monotheism, not yet. This is hierarchical theology, one high God presiding over lesser administrators, the Mesopotamian model exported for millennia. In the book of Job, God convenes a council. The sons of God present themselves. Among them is a figure later tradition will paint as rebel. But in the text's structure, he functions as an agent within the assembly, a prosecutor-like role inside the bureaucracy. Again, council, deliberation, assigned roles, cosmic governance. Scholars often describe these elements as fossils, remnants of a more polytheistic stage, and perhaps they are. But fossils are evidence of what lived before. And what these fossils reveal is less about theology and more about transmission. The same pattern appears in flood narratives. Mesopotamia's Gilgamesh tells of gods convening before the deluge. They deliberate, they regret, they weep. The flood is not random. It is decision enforcement reset. Later versions shift the language. A single god may be emphasized. The pantheon may be simplified. But the structure remains moral judgment catastrophe as correction, survival, as covenant-like continuity. Other cultures preserve flood echoes too. The story shape persists because it solves a recurring problem. How do you justify catastrophe? How do you frame collapse as meaning rather than randomness? Flood as reset becomes a technology of interpretation, a way to say the world is corrected, not merely destroyed. And this technology travels like any other that works. Not because people are converted, because stable systems spread. The framework stabilizes authority. If law comes from gods, it is harder to contest. If kingship is delegated by divine councils, seizing it becomes sacrilege. If moral order is cosmic, rebellion becomes existential. And when you watch it spread, you notice something else. The names disappear. The framework does not. By the time Alexander conquers the Near East, centuries later, the Anunnaki are no longer active figures. Their names survive mostly in texts few can read. No one is writing new hymns to them. No festivals celebrate them. Kings do not cite them. They fade. And yet the ideas they carry, the logic, are everywhere. The belief that law exists above rulers, that justice is not merely royal preference, that authority must be justified by something external. And then comes the shift that is almost invisible while it happens. Named deities are replaced by abstract principles, not abruptly, gradually, so gradually it feels natural. In law codes like Hammurabi's kings still insist they did not invent justice, they implement it. They enforce righteousness, they do not originate it. Gods are named, but the crucial point is the architecture law is external to the ruler. And as the framework becomes self-sustaining, the specific assembly of gods becomes unnecessary. The Anunnaki can vanish because their function has been absorbed. Their job legitimizing order has been internalized. And once internalized, a civilization no longer needs to say the name for the concept to work. This is the quiet victory of infrastructure. What began as divine counsels becomes principle. What began as cosmic ratification becomes legitimacy. What began as God's judging becomes law above power. And later cultures inherit the framework without realizing it ever belonged to specific gods. They assume it has always been this way. That law is naturally external. That authority naturally requires justification. That justice naturally exists above rulers. But it was not always this way. Earlier human societies relied on kinship and custom reciprocity, personal relationships, tribal memory. Law in the abstract sense imposed from above, justified by something external, is not universal instinct. It is innovation. And in Mesopotamia, that innovation is justified theologically. It requires gods who judge gods, who enforce gods, who make consequence inescapable. Once the framework is embedded, the gods can fade. Because the idea has become portable, the architecture can travel without the original names. So the question becomes sharper. If the gods vanished, but the logic endured, what exactly did humanity inherit? And why does that inheritance feel so natural now that we rarely notice it? To answer that, we have to return again back to the moment when writing law theology and kingship appear together. Because that simultaneity is not coincidence. It is requirement. And the deeper we go, the more it begins to look as though belief did not follow civilization. Belief enabled it. The simultaneity is the clue. Writing, law, theology, kingship. They do not appear together by accident. They appear together because they require each other. For a long time, historians have treated early religion as a byproduct of civilization. People settle cities, grow complexity, increases, and gods are invented to explain and soothe. But the Mesopotamian record keeps suggesting something more unsettling. Belief did not follow civilization. Belief enabled it. Because there is a threshold of complexity where old forms of social glue stop working. In a village, authority can be personal. Everyone knows everyone. Kinship ties bind obligations. Memory is shared. Disputes can be settled by elders whose legitimacy is visible and rooted in relationship. But in a city of thousands, strangers living side by side, kinship collapses as a governing mechanism. You need something else, something external, something that can bind people who do not share ancestors, who do not share history, who do not share personal loyalty. You need a structure that precedes individuals. And the fastest way to create that structure is to claim you did not create it, to say it was already there, already ancient, already enforced by powers no human can challenge. This is not merely deception, it is infrastructure. Because the Anunnaki are not primarily explanations for thunderstorms and harvests. They are explanations for why anyone should obey laws they did not help write. Why a farmer in Uruk should accept the authority of a king he will never meet. Why a merchant should honor contracts with strangers. Why a laborer should work for a temple that claims divine ownership of grain. The gods do not justify nature. They justify civilization. And they do it by introducing something that earlier societies did not need at scale: impersonal authority. Before Mesopotamia, authority is embodied. The strongest warrior, the oldest clan member, the most persuasive speaker, Power resides in individuals and lasts only as long as those individuals can maintain it. But the Anunnaki are not individuals. They are a system, a council, a procedural collective. They do not rule because they are strong. They rule because they are organized. An organization encoded into theology becomes unquestionable. Because theology, unlike politics, claims permanence. It claims a source beyond dispute. This is why the earliest writing is administrative. Receipts, lists, accounts. It preserves the machinery of belief, not merely stories. Because belief at this stage is not abstract philosophy. It is operational practice. It is repeated daily through rations distributed in a God's name. Oaths sworn before an unseen assembly. Kings crowned as stewards, not owners. Calendars enforced as cosmic schedule. The gods do not need to appear. The system needs only the belief that they are watching. And a belief repeated through daily procedures becomes indistinguishable from reality. This is why myth, in many cases, comes later, because once the infrastructure is established, stories can be written to explain it, dramatize it, ritualize it. But the foundation is already working before the narrative tries to justify it. And that reframes the question again. The question is no longer whether the Anunnaki were real. The question is whether they needed to be. If a society organizes itself around the belief that cosmic law enforces moral behavior, and if that belief stabilizes cooperation at scale, then the factual status of the gods becomes almost irrelevant. What matters is whether the framework works. And for thousands of years, it worked. Which leads to the unsettling formulation. The Anunnaki were not gods humanity worshipped. They were gods humanity used to encode moral consequence into the cosmos, used to justify hierarchy without constant violence, used to turn strangers into citizens of the same order. They were tools for thinking about order when order became too large to manage with personal bonds. And that is why belief appears fully formed. Not necessarily because beings revealed themselves, but because cities required a complete system immediately. You cannot build Uruk slowly while also slowly developing the idea of impersonal law. You cannot coordinate large labor forces, manage irrigation across miles, distribute resources, arbitrate disputes among strangers while still deciding whether authority should exist. The system has to function from the start, and to function, it has to be complete. So the Anunnaki arrive complete with hierarchies, jurisdictions, enforcement mechanisms, not necessarily because they are remembered literal beings, but because anything less complete would collapse under the weight of the complexity it is trying to stabilize. And if that is the case, then we have to say it again more than once until it sinks beneath the surface. Religion did not evolve from simple to complex in this context. It appeared complex because complexity demanded it. And once humanity learned a working model for impersonal authority, cosmic law, moral accountability, enforced beyond human reach, the framework became permanent. Even when gods faded, new religions emerged, philosophies developed, sciences advanced. The structure remained, because the structure was never primarily about gods. It was about how humans organized themselves at scale. And if belief was survival technology, cognitive infrastructure, then it shaped more than the past. It shaped the present. We still ask permission from structures we no longer see, Every legal system in the modern world operates on an assumption it rarely examines. Law exists above those who enforce it. Judges interpret law. Legislators write law. Police enforce law. But none of them create the authority of law itself. That authority is treated as external, foundational. Ask where it comes from, and the answers become circular, natural law. Social contract, constitutional order. Each explanation points to something prior, something discovered rather than invented. That is Mesopotamian architecture. And we inherit it so completely that it no longer feels like inheritance. It feels like instinct. The modern courtroom with elevated judge procedural formality assumption that justice exists independently of personal preference resembles structurally the divine councils that once sat behind oaths in Sumerian temples. The judge is not divine, but the judge represents something higher than individual will, something that demands obedience through legitimacy, not merely force. And legitimacy in this framework is always external. In democratic systems, authority is said to derive from the people. But even this carries the same architecture. The people invoked as an impersonal collective leaders delegated power rather than seizing it. Officials held accountable to principles they did not create. The source changes. The structure persists. Where Mesopotamia placed gods, modernity places constitutions. Where kings claimed divine delegation, presidents claim electoral mandate. But the logic remains. Authority must come from somewhere beyond the ruler. Strip away language, and the framework is ancient. And it appears again in moral philosophy, the idea that certain principles exist objectively: justice, dignity, rights. Debates rage over the source, but the shared assumption is that morality is recognized, not invented. Cosmic enforcement reframed, God's absent logic intact. So the question becomes unavoidable if we still think in Mesopotamian structures without realizing it. Then how much of the ancient world is still thinking through us? And if that is true, then the final loop returns us to where we began. The question was never, were the Anunnaki real beings? The question was always, why did humanity need them? And the answer keeps forming quietly from the same clay. We needed a way to justify order when order could no longer be personal. We needed a language for moral consequence when consequence could no longer be immediate. We needed impersonal authority when human relationships could no longer hold a city together. And once we learned that language, we never stopped speaking it. Now the task is to look back one more time slowly at what the tablets are truly showing. Not gods as entertainment, not myth as fantasy, but belief as infrastructure. Because the clay doesn't just preserve stories, it preserves the machinery that made civilization possible. And when we return to Uruk with that lens, the garbage piles stop being ordinary. They become the birthplace of the invisible architecture we still live inside. Let's return to the clay again. Not because we forgot it, but because the clay is where the argument refuses to float away. It's easy to discuss inheritance in abstract terms, frameworks, structures, cultural DNA. Those phrases can become airy. They can sound like metaphor. But the clay is weight. It is physical. It is stubborn. And what it records is not a myth told once around a fire. It is repetition, daily procedure, institutional habit, which means the clay does not simply show what people imagined. It shows what people did. And that's why the earliest tablets matter so much. They do not open with cosmic poetry. They open with accounting. Because accounting is the signature of a world where survival depends on system. And the system in Uruk and beyond is saturated with the assumption that order is divine. Not divine as a distant mystery, divine as an administrative reality. Offerings are logged, rations are tracked, days are fixed, oaths are sworn, disputes are arbitrated. And behind these procedures is always the same logic. Someone is watching. Someone can enforce consequence beyond human reach. Someone or something holds legitimacy. This is the function the Anunnaki fill. They are invoked not as comfort, but as enforcement. And when enforcement becomes part of the cosmos, something crucial happens inside society. Order gains weight. It becomes heavier than a king's personal preference, heavier than a priest's temporary power, heavier than a warrior's strength, because it is anchored in something that claims permanence. That is why early Mesopotamian kings repeatedly describe themselves as stewards. It is why legal codes and prologues frame law as implemented, not invented. The ruler is not the source. The ruler is the instrument, and that instrument is judged, which loops us back to judgment again, because judgment is what makes the structure stable. Without judgment, divine law is sentimental. With judgment, divine law is infrastructure. The Anunnaki appear as those who determine destinies, those who witness oaths, those who sit in assembly, those who ratify decisions, those who legitimize catastrophe. They are not characters. They are the principle that order must be upheld and that consequence is inescapable. And if you see them that way, then the long persistence of the framework becomes less mysterious. Because systems that stabilize cooperation spread. Not because people are naive, not because people are always searching for gods, but because people are searching for stability. A city where strangers can cooperate without constant violence will outcompete a city where every contract is personal and every dispute ends in blood. A society where authority is justified beyond the ruler's muscle can endure dynastic change and still function. A system where law is external can outlive rulers. And once that idea becomes normal, it is almost impossible to imagine society without it, which is precisely what seems to have happened. The Anunnaki fade, but the logic remains. Named gods are replaced by principle. Councils become law. Divine delegation becomes mandate. Cosmic enforcement becomes legitimacy. And then the inheritance becomes invisible. We inherit the structure and forget it was once an invention. And that forgetfulness is part of what makes the original evidence so uncomfortable. Because if you accept that Mesopotamia exported the architecture of impersonal authority, then you also have to accept something else. Many of the assumptions we treat as universal are not universal at all. They are historical. They are transmitted. They are learned. We say no one is above the law, as though it is a natural human insight. But it depends on the idea that law exists above power, an idea that must be invented, justified, taught, enforced. We say authority must be legitimate, as though legitimacy is self-evident. But legitimacy depends on an external source beyond personal relationship, an abstraction that must be culturally constructed. We say justice must be impartial, as though impartiality is instinct. But impartiality is the logic of council's procedure, judgment structures built to manage strangers. These are not automatic human intuitions. They are frameworks. And the Mesopotamian record suggests those frameworks were operational from the moment writing begins. Which returns us again to the fracture. Why does the first written civilization already possess this complete architecture? If belief were merely a slow cultural poem, you would expect early fragments, trial runs, partial systems, inconsistent gods, improvised moral language. But the record we have is not improvised. It is procedural, and procedure implies maturity. It implies a system already tested, already coherent enough to run daily life. So what explains this? The script we are following refuses to introduce new facts beyond what is in the record we're already describing. So we do not escape into speculation. We do not reach for outsiders. We do not add new hypotheses. Instead, we stay inside the lens already offered belief as inherited framework, belief as survival tool, belief as infrastructure that cities require. And within that lens, the completeness becomes less strange. Because if cities require a complete system immediately, then the earliest written records would not show gradual theological evolution. They would show operational theology, the theology needed for a city to function. And that is exactly what the clay shows, which raises a different kind of question, not historical, but psychological. If a framework functions so well that it becomes invisible, how do you ever recognize it as inherited? How do you see the architecture when you live inside it? Because the most powerful structures are not the ones you can point to. They are the ones you stop noticing. They shape thought before thought becomes conscious. They shape what feels normal. They shape what feels obvious. And that is why the Anunnaki matter not as gods you worship, but as a name attached to an early blueprint for how humans justify order. A blueprint so effective, it dissolves into the foundation of later civilization. So, the story is not only about ancient tablets, it is about modern minds. Because if we still operate within this inherited architecture, then the ancient world is not behind us. It is inside us. We can see it in the way we treat authority. We demand justification. We demand procedure. We demand that rulers answer to law. Even when we no longer invoke gods, we invoke abstractions that function like gods once did. Constitution rights mandate legitimacy. We might call these secular, but structurally, they do the same work. They place authority outside the ruler. They make obedience about legitimacy rather than fear. They stabilize cooperation among strangers. They turn social order into something that feels like it exists independently of individual will. That is the inheritance. So the next step is not to drift into modern examples beyond what the script already holds. We stay within its own arc. If the architecture survived because it worked, then the final question is not whether the Anunnaki existed. It is what it means that we are still living in their structure. And to feel that meaning, we have to return once more to the deepest claim the clay whispers. Order is not natural. It is enforced. And the belief that it must be enforced becomes the most durable technology of all. There is a reason the story keeps circling back instead of moving straight forward. Straight lines are for efficiency. This isn't efficient. It's structural. Because the subject here is not simply ancient religion. The subject is how an idea becomes so foundational that later generations stop recognizing it as an idea at all, and you can't understand that in one pass. You have to return to it from multiple angles, the way you return to a building, and notice a different support beam each time. So let's say it again. Not because it is new, but because it is central. The Anunnaki were obeyed like law, not adored like myth. And that difference is the hinge. When you look at early Mesopotamian texts through that hinge, the strange completeness stops looking like fantasy and starts looking like necessity. Because what do cities need? They need coordination. They need division of labor. They need predictable schedules. They need arbitration that doesn't be endless blood feud. They need authority that can bind strangers. An authority that can bind strangers has to be impersonal. It has to be external. It has to feel larger than any one individual. This is the problem the framework solves. And the framework solves it by saying, the order you obey is not invented by the king. It is not a personal preference. It is not negotiable like a tribal bargain. It is cosmic. It is older than you. It is enforced by something beyond you. That is what turns obedience into morality. That is what turns compliance into duty. And once compliance becomes duty, social stability becomes possible at scale. Now, within the script's own language, this is why temples aren't just religious buildings. They are administrative centers. They are the engines of economic distribution. They hold archives. They train scribes. They coordinate labor forces. They track offerings with bureaucratic precision. And every transaction becomes a reinforcement of the framework. If a worker receives rations from the gods, he learns that his survival is linked to participation in the divine order. If a contract is sworn before the Anunnaki, the merchant learns that agreements are enforced not merely by social threat, but by cosmic consequence. If a king is crowned through divine delegation, the population learns that authority is not personal ambition, it is office. And office implies procedure, and procedure implies legitimacy. So the structure becomes self-reinforcing, and that is why it lasts. This is also why dismissal becomes part of the story, because modern institutions, universities, museums, theology often prefer to treat the tablets as literature or myth rather than as the record of a foundational framework. Not because the tablets are secret, because the implications are heavy. If the earliest written civilization already contains a complete model of impersonal authority, cosmic law, delegated kingship, and procedural legitimacy, then the origins of much of what we call civilization look less like a natural human unfolding and more like a historically specific invention that was exported and inherited. And once you see that, it becomes difficult to keep calling our modern assumptions universal. They become contingent, they become historical, they become inherited, which can be disorienting because we like to believe our deepest assumptions are ours. We like to believe we arrived at them through reason and progress. But the clay insists these assumptions were embedded long before we could name them. The moment humanity began to write, humanity was already writing the language of external authority. And we still speak that language. So the question becomes more personal, even if we don't want it to. If we inherit frameworks without noticing, what else might we be inheriting? Not new facts, just a deeper sense of the theme already present. Because inheritance is not only biological, it is conceptual. And conceptual inheritance shapes how you interpret the world before you even realize you are interpreting it. It shapes what feels right, what feels legitimate, what feels ordered. Which brings us again to catastrophe, because catastrophe is where the framework's enforcement becomes clearest. Flood as reset, catastrophe as correction. The idea that when moral order is violated, the world itself responds. In Mesopotamian narratives, floods are not random storms. They are moral events, decisions, enforced resets. And later cultures inherit that structure too, even when they change the gods and the language. The flood becomes a universal story shape because it encodes the principle that order is maintained, not assumed. That chaos is always near. That stability requires enforcement. This principle keeps returning because it performs a function. It justifies suffering as correction rather than meaninglessness. It justifies authority as protection against chaos. It makes obedience feel like participation in survival. So, when priests recite creation myths annually, they are not merely telling stories. They are renewing the contract. They are reminding the population you live inside a system. Your work maintains it. Your rituals uphold it. Your obedience keeps chaos away. This is not comfort. It is management. And within management, the Anunnaki remain, even if they fade, as named deities. Because what they represent is the requirement that authority be legitimized beyond the ruler. In the Enuma Elish, they ratify Marduk. In oaths, they witness. In judgment, they determine destinies. They enforce the idea that power must be recognized, not merely taken, and that recognition becomes the blueprint for later legal and political systems. So by the time the Anunnaki disappear from active worship, their job has been completed. Their function has become internalized. Authority becomes law. Judgment becomes justice. Procedure becomes legitimacy. The gods vanish because the concept remains. And that is the most unsettling part, not that gods were once worshipped, but that their administrative logic became permanent. So permanent that we treat it as common sense, which is why even in modernity, we cannot escape the structure. We still insist that leaders justify power. We still insist that law stands above rulers. We still insist that justice is not merely personal preference. Even secular ethics often assumes moral accountability exists beyond detection, beyond social punishment, because the structure of consequence has been inherited, reframed. We don't call it cosmic, but we feel it. We talk about principles as though they exist. We talk about rights as though they are discovered. We talk about justice as though it is real, independent of our agreement. This is the ancient architecture wearing modern language. And if that is true, then the final movement of this story is not toward proving anything beyond the script's own claims. It is toward recognition, toward seeing. Because the deepest frameworks are not the ones you can argue about easily. They are the ones you live inside without noticing. So, the question returns one more time in the simplest form possible. What did humanity inherit, not the gods' names, not the myths intact? The structure, the assumption that order must be justified, the assumption that law must come from somewhere higher than will, the assumption that authority descends and must be ratified. And if we inherit those assumptions so completely that they feel natural, then the ancient world is not merely history, it is foundation. And foundations do not announce themselves. They support everything silently. The clay tells us that the silent support has a name, and the name once was Anunnaki. There is a particular kind of power that does not need to shout. It doesn't command attention. It doesn't demand love. It doesn't even need to be remembered clearly. It simply sets the rules of the room, and then, after enough time, everyone in the room forgets there were ever other rules. That's the kind of power this story keeps circling. Because what we are tracing is not a pantheon. We are tracing a blueprint. And blueprints don't need worship to survive. They need use. They need repetition. They need to solve a problem so effectively that societies build on them again and again, even when the original explanation fades. So when we say the Anunnaki disappear, we have to be careful about what disappear means. Their names fade from festivals. Their hymns stop being written. Kings stop invoking them explicitly. But the architecture they introduced becomes stronger than any name. It becomes self-sustaining, and you can see that in law. When Hammurabi compiles his code, he does not present it as personal invention. He frames himself as chosen to establish righteousness, to implement justice already recognized as cosmic. The language retains gods, but the structure is the true inheritance. Law exists above the ruler. Justice is external. The king enforces, he does not originate. And this pattern repeats through later Near Eastern legal traditions. Again and again, the ruler is framed as steward. Again and again, law is framed as discovered or revealed. Again and again, authority is framed as delegated, which means that the original assembly, the Anunnaki, has done its work. The function has been absorbed into the concept of law itself. This is how structures outlive their sources. They become normal, so normal that later cultures inherit them without noticing. And that is the moment when a framework becomes truly powerful. Because once it is normal, it does not need defense. It becomes the baseline from which everything else is judged. This baseline law above rulers' authority, requiring justification, moves into larger empires. Persian administration adopts external law structures. Hellenistic thought inherits the assumption that justice is universal, not merely local preference. Roman jurists articulate natural law, the idea that legitimate law conforms to cosmic order. And again, the gods are gone. But the logic remains. The logic that legitimacy must be external, that rulers answer to something higher than force, that justice exists independently of the ruler's will. This is Mesopotamian theology, stripped of named deities and reframed as reason. And because it is framed as reason, it becomes even more portable. You do not need to worship Marduk to accept universal justice. You do not need to invoke Anunnaki to insist no one is above the law. You simply need the inherited assumption that law is real beyond power. And once that assumption is accepted, you live inside it. You build institutions around it. You punish violations as moral failures rather than merely political crimes. You condemn tyrants not because they lose, but because they violate external law. You justify revolutions not by success, but by principle. And even when societies call themselves secular, they still operate on these inherited foundations. They still speak the language of external legitimacy. They still assume structure precedes individual will. So here is the loop, again stated as quietly as possible. The Anunnaki vanished as gods, but their framework became the way humans think about authority. And that framework is so ancient and so embedded that we mistake it for instinct. Now, if we remain inside the script's own arc, the final movement is not to expand outward with new examples. It is to look at what has been said and feel its weight. Because the core claim is not flashy. It is simple. Civilization requires impersonal authority. Impersonal authority requires external justification. External justification in early cities takes theological form, and once that theological form becomes institutional habit, it can survive the loss of its original names. That's the mechanism. Not magic, not mystery, infrastructure. So, when the tablets show us administrative records that are already theological, when king lists describe kingship as descending from heaven, when myths describe creation as assignment rather than origin, we are seeing the same principle expressed in multiple domains. The universe is governed like a system. Society is governed like a system. Authority is legitimate only when it is ratified by something beyond the individual. And the Anunnaki are the early name attached to that ratifying structure. Now we are brought back again to the modern world, not to introduce new content, but to reflect the same structure already described. In modern courts, the judge represents something higher than personal will. Procedure matters. Formality matters. The legitimacy of the decision depends on process, not personality. In democracies, leaders are delegated power and bound by principles they did not invent. Even when the people are named as the source, the people function as an abstraction that stands above any one citizen. In moral philosophy, we speak of rights and justice, as though they exist, as though they can be discovered. The gods are absent. The architecture remains. So the final question returns to its simplest, most human form. If the deepest assumptions guiding our institutions are inherited, not invented, then the ancient world is not behind us. It is under us. It is holding up the room. And that means the Anunnaki story is not primarily a story about whether ancient beings existed. It is a story about why human societies need the idea of external order to function. A story about the invention or inheritance of legitimacy. A story about how, the moment we began to write, we began to build civilization on the assumption that order is older than us. And once we build on that assumption, we can't easily stop. We can forget the gods. But we cannot forget the structure without dismantling everything we have built. That is what inheritance looks like when it becomes invisible. And perhaps that is why the record feels so complete so early, because the framework did not need centuries of slow religious poetry to evolve. It needed to function immediately, and it did. So we end where we began, but with a slightly different weight in the words. The question was never whether the Anunnaki were real. The question was why humanity needed them. And the answer keeps returning patiently, like the rhythm of a ritual recited each year. We needed a way to justify authority among strangers. We needed a way to make law feel external. We needed a way to make order enforceable beyond power. We needed a framework that could stabilize complexity. And once we learned that framework, we never stopped using it. If you've ever stood inside a building and tried to see its foundation, you know the problem. The foundation is not designed to be seen. It is designed to hold. And the more successfully it holds, the less you think about it. That is the paradox of infrastructure. When it works, it disappears into normality. That is what has happened with the framework we are tracing. The Anunnaki vanish as named gods. And yet the world keeps running on the logic they embody, which means the inheritance has already succeeded. It has become invisible. So what does it mean to say we inherited divine order? Not that we inherited a set of mythic characters, but that we inherited a way of thinking, that authority must be ratified, that law must be external, that order is not negotiable preference, but foundational structure. And once that way of thinking becomes embedded, it shapes thought before we even realize it. It shapes what questions we ask. It shapes what answers feel acceptable. It shapes what we consider legitimate. This is why the script insists that the most difficult part is not the tablets, it's the reaction to them. Because reactions reveal what a culture finds safe. Universities often place the texts under literature. Museums often place them under art. Theology often places them under myth. Those categories are not necessarily wrong, but they can function as distance. They allow us to admire without being implicated. Because if the tablets are merely myth, then modern law can claim independent birth. Modern philosophy can claim pure reason. Modern ethics can claim universal instinct. But if the tablets record the origin of a framework we still live inside, then our assumptions are not purely ours. They are inherited, and inheritance complicates pride. It complicates modern self-understanding because it suggests that some of what we consider advanced might be ancient in structure, not outdated, embedded. So again, we return to the clay. Those administrative records at Uruk are not myths. They are evidence of daily institutional life shaped by theology. Divine names appear in ration lists. Oaths invoke unseen assemblies. Kingship is framed as delegated from heaven. Calendars are aligned to sacred schedules. And beneath it all is the same architecture. Order is enforced. Legitimacy is external. Authority is procedural. And the Anunnaki are the early symbol of that architecture. This is why the Anunnaki feel different than nature gods. Because nature gods can fade when societies change their relationship to the environment. But gods of order, gods of judgment, are harder to discard because they are woven into how society justifies itself. Once a civilization builds law around the concept of external legitimacy, it cannot easily return to purely personal authority. It can change the name of the source, but it cannot remove the need for a source. So the source shifts from gods to principle, from councils to law, from divine mandate to constitution, from cosmic judgment to moral rights. The structure persists because the structure is doing work. It is solving the same problem across time. How do you create cooperation among strangers? How do you enforce contracts without relying entirely on personal fear? How do you justify obedience without constant violence? How do you stabilize authority so the system outlives the individual ruler? The framework answers: make authority external, make law higher than the ruler, make moral consequence inescapable. And in early Mesopotamia, the name attached to that higher structure was the Anunnaki. So, if we accept this even as a lens rather than a literal claim, we arrive at a quieter, more unsettling conclusion. The ancient world is not only past, it is present as structure. It is present in how we design institutions. It is present in how we argue about legitimacy. It is present in the assumption that order must be justified, not merely imposed. And once you see that, you begin to notice the inheritance everywhere, not as an influence, but as a template. And templates do not announce themselves. They simply shape what is built. So now the final loop returns one last time. Not with new facts, but with the same question sharpened by repetition. Why did humanity need the Anunnaki? Because humanity needed a language for impersonal authority. Because cities required a complete system of legitimacy immediately. Because the moment strangers must cooperate, law must be external. Because order must feel older than any king. And once the language was created or inherited, it became permanent. not because it was true in a scientific sense, but because it was useful in a civilizational sense. It stabilized societies. It reduced internal violence. It allowed large-scale cooperation. It made complex life possible. And what works survives. So the story ends not with the gods returning, but with us recognizing what we already live inside. Because the real inheritance is not a pantheon. It is a habit of mind, a structural assumption. Order exists. Order precedes us. Order must be discovered, not invented. And that assumption, whether we call it divine or secular, shapes how we live. It shapes how we govern. It shapes how we judge. It shapes what we believe reality itself must be. And perhaps that is the final quiet irony. The gods were forgotten. But the architecture remained so perfectly that we stopped recognizing it as architecture. We began to call it the way things are. And if that is true, then the clay tablets are not merely ancient artifacts. They are early blueprints. Blueprints for the invisible walls we still build our lives within. So we return to the beginning, one last time, slowly, deliberately, because beginnings are the places where frameworks reveal themselves most clearly. There is a group of gods most people have never heard of, not because they were minor, but because their role was never to be remembered as characters. Their role was to be embedded, to become structure, to become assumption. The Anunnaki were not worshipped like Zeus or Odin. They were obeyed like law. And ancient Mesopotamian texts describe them not as creators, but as administrators, organizers who divide labor, assign roles, and make cosmic decisions through councils and deliberation. When they fade from history, their names disappear. But the framework they introduced never leaves. Authority must be justified. Law exists above rulers. Order precedes chaos. That framework becomes the invisible architecture of civilization itself. Uruk's tablets, found in garbage piles, are not poetic hymns. They are administrative records, temple accounts, divine ration logs. And within that bureaucracy is already a complete theology, gods with jurisdictions, gods with hierarchies, gods who assign tasks, enforce moral law, legitimize kingship. No trial period, no visible evolution. Just order appearing fully formed at the moment humans begin to write. And that is where the fracture begins. Because the standard story says, belief develops gradually. But the Sumerian record shows writing law and theology arriving together, structured, authoritative, operational. The king lists describe rulership as something that descended from heaven. Human authority is not seized, it is granted. Creation myths describe the universe, organized through assignment, not birthed from chaos. Human purpose is defined with unsettling precision. We exist to maintain divine order. And the deeper you look, the more deliberate the system becomes. The Anunnaki are not vague spirits. They are described as administrators, dividing labor, enforcing consequence, defining sacred time, ratifying power. Scholars can call it myth metaphor, symbolic thought. But the pattern keeps returning belief systems that appear too complete, too early, carrying authority embedded from the start. Why would the first written societies already possess fully developed cosmologies that explain kingship, morality, labor, and justice? Why do the oldest texts describe divine councils as if governance existed before humans invented it. And why does the same architecture reappear across later cultures, even when the gods' names change? Trade alone doesn't explain it. Fire alone doesn't explain it. Conquest alone doesn't explain it. But a sequence of all three over time can transmit something deeper than names a framework, an inherited structure. Imagine belief not as invention, but as inherited architecture, conceptual tools for understanding authority, consequence, division of labor, in a world suddenly organized by cities, temples, law. Then the tablets make sense. Kingship taught by gods. Creation as assignment. Offerings tracked as if gods require accountants. Infrastructure memory preserved through clay ritual institutional practice. And if that's true, the question changes. Not, did the Anunnaki exist physically, but why did humanity need them? What problem were these beliefs solving? And why did the framework law, above rulers, heaven, above earth, morality enforced by higher authority, outlive the gods and echo into every civilization that followed? The evidence doesn't vanish. It spreads. From Sumer to Akkad to Babylon to Assyria, into Hittite lands and Canaanite cities, and into later traditions where divine councils still appear beneath smoother theology. Yet, institutions often react by distancing literature, art, myth categories that keep the implications at arm's length. Because the deeper possibility is heavy, we did not invent divine order. We inherited it. And if that's true, then much of what we treat as modern common sense authority, requiring justification law, existing above rulers' structure, preceding chaos, was not born from later philosophy. It was born from the earliest administrative theology, encoded in clay. Not because the Anunnaki were gods in the way we imagine gods now, but because they represent how early humans learned to think about order. And once humanity learned that way of thinking, humanity never stopped. Even when the gods disappeared, the logic remained disguised as principles, justice, legitimacy, natural law, constitutional order. We still speak the structure. We still live inside it. So, the closing question is the same as the opening question, now spoken with the weight of repetition. If our earliest beliefs shaped how we understand authority, morality, and meaning, how much of the ancient world is still thinking through us? And if that is true, then the Anunnaki are not merely a forgotten name in a museum case. They are an early blueprint, an invisible architecture, a framework that outlived its own gods because it worked, and what works survives. If you want, and only after this point quietly, without breaking the atmosphere, consider returning to the clay again sometime, not for answers in the modern sense, but for recognition. Because the deepest inheritance is not a story we remember. It is a structure we live inside without noticing. And seeing it even briefly changes what civilization feels like.